Welcome back, everybody, coast to coast. This Week in America, online, thisweekinamerica.us. The trilogy Whisper in My Ear has been called by one reviewer the best series I've ever read. It brings history to life, and you don't want to put it down. From acclaimed author John Henry Hardy. It's the 1960s, and cultural and political unrest is sweeping across America. In the midst of this turmoil, three young Americans find themselves on a path that sends them to join in the war effort in Vietnam. While in Vietnam, along with a beautiful young nurse from the Philippines, they are forced to confront enemies from their past while walking into an uncertain future. John, the author, is a Marine Corps veteran more than 33 years, first as an artilleryman, then a military policeman. As a public affairs officer, he wrote numerous newspaper and magazine articles, several winning Freedom's Foundation awards. Recalled to active duty in 1994, served until he was forced to retire because of his age, a bachelor's degree in psychology from Rutgers, a master's in business management from the University of Phoenix. John is a retired AT&T territorial support manager. And John Henry Hardy, our guest on the program, author of the trilogy Whisper in My Ear, and he's with us on today's program. John, welcome to the show. It's great to have you with us today.
Thank you, Rick, and it's nice of you to have me on. I appreciate it.
Well, there's so much to talk about on the books, and you've written other books, but the three we're talking about, Whisper in My Ear, Volume 3 of 3, is now available. It's interesting how this whole trilogy started for you. Talk about that. Your inspiration was something that you witnessed firsthand as American soldiers were returning from Vietnam and not returning in a friendly manner.
Yeah, that's true, Rick. When I did my first stint in the Marine Corps, of course, I saw a lot on television of the demonstrators and people carrying Viet Cong flags, dragging the American flag along the ground. Heard the remarks they made to returning veterans. They were spit at. They were called baby killers. And on my way to this class one day at Rutgers University, I stopped in to listen to one of those groups who were meeting and demonstrating on the college campus. And I listened for a few minutes, and I realized these people don't know what in the heck they're talking about.
Yes.
They were bashing this 18 and 19-year-old kid with his beard and his long hair was up before the mic, bashing the veterans, saying how they were indiscriminately killing people in Vietnam, causing harm to babies, raping women. And I'm looking at this kid and I'm saying to myself, these people here have no idea what the hell they're talking about. And half of them were stoned. A lot of them weren't even paying attention to what the speaker was saying. And I said to myself, one of these days when I get a chance, I'm going to write something about what really happened in Vietnam and how the veterans were treated, not only during the war, but also when they returned home. And so when I retired, I sat down and I started writing. And it took me a number of years to write this book, partly because my wife was gravely ill for several years and has partially recovered, thank the good Lord. And so I was able to finish this trilogy and present it to Amazon, and their independent publishing company, CreateSpace, published the book.
And the book we're talking about is Whisper in My Ear. It's 3 volumes, volume 3 of 3, now available. You'll find the book, of course, at Amazon. John Henry Hardy is our guest. His website is jhhardy.com. Very simple to remember. And, of course, you can link on directly to John's website and information on the book. And you can order the book by going to our website, thisweekinamerica.us. The series has been described as a love story that depicts the actual events of the war from the perspective of the men and women who served there. It's very realistic. Let's talk about that aspect of it. These are not necessarily real people, but what traits of real people. And you're depicting the war and what they went through from actual firsthand accounts of veterans of the military who returned and from research. So what you're laying out is really an accurate story with somewhat fictional characters, but based on real-life characters as well.
Yes, and this is true, Rick. The characters in the story, the 4 main characters, are fictitious. However, let me emphasize that they are very typical of the men and women who serve there. The combat that you're going to read about in the book is true to form. It's true to form from research. It's true to form from talking to veterans who returned from the war. And I also want to emphasize the fact that this is not just about the Marine Corps. This is about all of the people who served in Vietnam. Because when you are in a war, you are a team. It doesn't matter what the color of your uniform is, what your rank is, you have to be there for the safety of your brothers and also to win battles. The most important being accomplishing the mission that you were sent out to do. The scenes of the treatment of Americans is very, very true to life. When you get down to the Hanoi Hilton, or Hoa Lo as it was known in Vietnam, a lot of the events are based on facts from the veterans who actually went through the tortures of what the North Vietnamese did to them. Their culture is very, very different from ours. They were ruled by a dictator. They were very patriotic to their own cause, and they were even as cruel to their own people in the South Vietnam as they were to the Americans. The country was divided in half in 1954 at the Geneva Convention and the defeat of the French at the Bien Phu. And a lot of the people who were in the North had converted to Catholicism and moved to the South. A lot of people in the South were Buddhists, and many of them moved to the North. The Buddhists were very, very intolerant of other religions. And at the beginning, when France first sent missionaries to Vietnam, many of them were murdered because the Buddhists were intolerant of religions, other religions.
Yes.
And so they sent military forces there to protect the priests and those who were converted to Catholicism. Part of the problem there was the French realized that the country was full of minerals and had rubber plantations, and it exploited a lot of that. And they were a much more educated country than Vietnam was at the time, and they took over control of the entire government.
You know, what's interesting. Yeah, you mentioned Hanoi Hilton, and as I'm reading that, and the series we're talking about is Whisper in My Ear. It's a story of people, and we'll talk about the main characters here in a minute, but it's also gives us sort of insight. Many of us who lived through that era are really not that familiar with the Vietnamese culture, and you bring that out with great accuracy in the book Whisper in My Ear. Hanoi Hilton is one of those. We hear it thrown around. It's become just sort of like an expression you throw out there. And this was horrible, the way people were treated in this place.
Yes, they were tortured horribly. They were beaten. They were starved. They were held in cells that were very dank and dark and dirty cells. A lot of the prisoners, when they were new to the prison, were kept isolated from the rest of the prisoners so they could be broken down. And almost every other man that went to Vietnam, to the Hanoi Hilton, was broken down. You're just a human being. Luckily, yes. There was a gentleman there by the name of, his name escapes me, he was a colonel, and he had the other prisoners actually memorize the names of people who were there, so that when the war was over, we would know exactly who was captured there and those that did not return from the war. And John McCain, who was the senator from Arizona and has represented us for the last 30 years, he was a guest of the Hanoi Hilton for many years, was wounded, shot down over Vietnam by a SAM missile, landed with 2 broken legs and a broken arm. He was treated horribly until the Vietnamese realized that his ancestors, his fathers and his uncles were admirals in the United States Navy, and that he had followed them in and became an A-4 pilot. So they tried to give him special treatment, but he refused it. He refused to come home. He said, I will wait until it's my turn. Of course, he didn't get out until after the prisoner of war exchange.
Yes. The book we're talking about is... Yeah, I was going to mention, so people that are just tuning in know what we're talking about. John Henry Hardy, our guest. The book is Whisper in My Ear. This is volume 3 of 3, but the whole trilogy is available. Didn't mean to cut you off. Go ahead and finish that thought. The book is so gripping, I want people to know what we're talking about and be able to get information on it.
Yeah, and I wanted to give Rick all of the uniformed services credit. Because it's not just one branch of the service. Like I said before, everyone was there. We were a team. One of the things that always irked me was the fact that women were not always recognized for what they've done in all the wars the U.S. has ever fought in. Even during the Revolutionary War, you have the legend of Molly Pitcher. during the American Civil War, some women disguised themselves as men and literally fought in battle with men disguised as men. When it came to Vietnam, a lot of the combat awards went to the combat units. And that's the people that got a lot of the publicity, the people who won the Medals of Honor, the people who won the Purple Hearts, the people who won the Silver Stars. But a lot of the heroism in the Vietnam War has to do with nurses too. You know, I discovered from talking to people who were wounded that you may never even see or remember the doctor who operated on you saved your life. But there is one person you will remember, and that is the nurse that took care of you.
Yes.
And one of the reasons for that is after the person's life was saved and they came to and realized that they had no legs or no arms, or one arm was missing, it was a horrible nightmare to wake up to. And it was the nurses that had to bear the brunt of that. It's the one that they became your mother, your sweetheart, the one you fell in love with, and the one that you would never forget for as long as you live. So I wanted to make sure that women got a lot of the credit that they do. Even the woman from Korea and the women who fought in World War II with the men, they got very little recognition because they got very few combat awards, if any. Toward the end of the Vietnam War, that started to change. And it was 4 nurses that were actually awarded Purple Hearts because they were wounded in downtown Saigon. So that aspect began to change during the Vietnam War. And of course, this continues today because women now serve in combat units. They get wounded and they get killed. And that volume 2 deals a lot with the contribution that women made to the war effort. Not only in the Navy, which was at Da Nang, and I talk a lot about the Da Nang Hospital, because the Da Nang Hospital was the largest military hospital in the world at the time. They treated over 60,000 patients before the war was over. Aboard the USS Sanctuary and the Repose, the hospital ships, the same was also true there for the nurses who served on board. So I just wanted to make sure, not only the fact that I have girls in my family who are my children, but I wanted to make sure that every woman gets all the credit that they deserve.
Yeah,
because
and
we were kind of in that respect.
Yeah, you talk about the role women played, the important role, whether they remain at home, which is incredibly important as well, or serve abroad. And you talk a lot about the combat nurses, and we see vividly in your words, your descriptions in Whisper in My Ear, the series we're talking about, of what they went through, of what our soldiers, our young soldiers went through in there as well. The characters are very realistic. They're trying to serve the Marine Corps, the U.S. Navy, trying to follow their orders whether they agree with them or not. And I'm thinking, and you probably found this in talking with the military, the veterans who came back, many probably didn't quite understand or necessarily agree with what they were doing, but they were following orders. Talk a little bit about that conflict. They're there, to represent the country, do what they're told, whether or not they agreed.
Yeah, you have to remember, Rick, that some of the soldiers who fought there and answered the call and were drafted were from the very same generation that were back home demonstrating against the war.
Yes.
There were that did not agree. However, they went. I have a perspective on that, Rick, but I used to think about it all the time. The generation that fought in World War II had gone through the Great Depression. And then on December 7th, 1941, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, and all of a sudden these same people who had very little to remember during the Depression and who worked to put food on the table while their mother and fathers went out and got menial jobs also, these same people fought in World War II. When the war was over, these people said, I had nothing when I was growing up. I'm going to give my kids everything I didn't have. And they did. They gave them money, they gave them cars, they gave them college educations. Unfortunately, to my way of thinking, the greatest generation spawned one of the worst generations that we ever had. And the reason for that is it was the me generation. They were used to getting things given to them. They were used to having their own way. And of course, when it came time to actually go into the military situation and risk your life, this generation didn't want to do it. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not denigrating everybody. There was a lot of fine young men and women who did answer the call and who went to Vietnam, and their name is now on that famous Vietnam Veterans Memorial Wall in Washington, D.C. So I'm not belittling them. But the demonstrators largely came from a lot of people who were young and didn't want to be drafted. They were afraid. They were afraid of the responsibility, and in a way you can't blame them. But the greatest generation also felt the same way. But they had learned over the years how to control their fear and do the job that they were meant to do.
John Henry,
that of course, is my opinion.
Well, yes, and a lot of people would say in recent times when we've had military activity going on, there's really not a sacrifice back home, and it's hard for some people to even realize that we are in a war situation. John Henry Hardy, our guest on the program, we're talking about his excellent series trilogy, Whisper in My Ear, Volume 3 of 3 now available. His website is jhhardy.com. Book, of course, available at Amazon. And you can link on directly to all of those at our website, thisweekinamerica.us. Time is going by way so quickly. Let's talk just briefly on the 4 characters and how they've actually developed. The luxury, I guess I would call it a luxury for 3 books, is you can grow these characters. We've got Dion, Kathy, Norman, and the Filipino nurse that I was talking about, Barbara. We've really come to know these people during the course of the trilogy.
Yes, and I purposely did that, Rick. The first volume of the book, I took a lot of time, and I dedicated almost a chapter to each of the 3 main American characters. Dion Murphy, who's an outstanding college football player and high school football player, is out trying for a slot on a professional football team. He's on the verge of getting a contract when his mother calls him and says, "Hey, a letter came from you from the Selective Service." And of course, it notified Dion that he was being drafted. The second character, Kathy Addison, is a nurse who had just graduated from Hamlin University School of Nursing, and she is in love with a boy and has been through high school and all through college. However, while she was in college, he turned out to be a real cad. He got his draft notice, he ran away to Canada, he became involved in drugs and human trafficking, and he tried to get her to pull her into that world with him, and she wouldn't do it, and he tried to kidnap her, but he failed. So she's brokenhearted. She meets a nurse that just came back from Vietnam named Marlene Larkin, who was supposed to spend a year there because the action got to her and she lost a soldier that she fell in love with. She didn't want to be a nurse anymore. So she came home and was on recruiting duty, recruited Kathy. And when Kathy heard that, hey, they're short-handed over there, they need somebody, and I have the skills, and she enlists into the U.S. Navy and heads over to Vietnam. The third character, Norman Coddington, is a playboy. He comes from a wealthy Bostonian family. His father owns and operates and runs a huge law firm, a renowned law firm, so that Norman grows up with everything that he ever wanted. The problem with his life is his mother married his father for his money. She didn't love him, but he was wealthy. She came from a poor background, and she had a little bit of a colorful past. She wanted to be a society lady. So when she married Norman Sr., she got into the society columns and the society life of Boston, but she really didn't love the 2 children that she had. And she treated them very badly. And Norman grew up with the idea of, well, maybe women are just good for one thing. So he's a playboy until he meets the 4th character in the story, Barbara Mandera, a beautiful Filipino nurse, and he falls in love with her. A lot of people don't know that the Filipinos sent nursing contingents to Vietnam. So did the Swedes, and so did Spain, and so did a few other countries. In fact, South Korea sent 2 full divisions of their Tigers to Vietnam to fight the Americans, as did the Australians and their special air services. So Norman falls in love with this girl for the first time. He's in love in his life, and he doesn't know how to handle it. And he's listening to his co-pilot in the Phantom, the F-4 Phantom, who's in love with his wife, can't wait to get home to see her, loves his daughter, and Norman finds this very puzzling. And then after he falls in love with this Filipino nurse, he begins to realize what his friend, the Rio, the man in the back seat with him, how he feels about women in life. And so Norman takes a chance and goes with this woman. He loves her and he's going to marry her. Problem is, she's a Filipino, and his mother is never going to accept a brown-skinned person in her high society life that she lives. It has to be somebody that's wealthy and somebody from a very, very prominent Boston family. I don't develop Barbara's character in the first 3 chapters. I just do the Americans first. But the Filipino nurse, I developed her character throughout the story because she comes from a very colorful past. She lived through the Japanese occupation of the Philippines. The Japanese, of course, considered the Filipinos to be subhumans. And many, many Filipino girls were raped during that time. A lot of the men who were non-combatants were murdered in the most heinous of ways, like the North Vietnamese did to the Americans at the Hanoi Hilton. And so Barbara has a very colorful past. She marries a man who is actually a psychopath, and he does horrible things to her. And she finally goes to nursing school, and she gets away from him. But he finds her again in Vietnam because he, being part of the corrupt regime in Washington, gets a big job over in Vietnam, and he runs across his ex-wife there. And the story carries on from there.
You know, it's interesting. All the backstory so fascinating with all of these, and to see them evolve over the course of these 3 books, it's incredible. Whisper in My Ear. A minute or so left in the program. One review said, after this incredible journey, it's difficult to say John Henry Hardy could top it, but fans can't wait to see him try. Are you going to try? Is this the end of what we've seen so far in Whisper in My Ear, or do you see a continuation?
One of these days, Rick, I'm going to sit down and write a sequel. It will be much shorter because, you know, everybody's life continues after the war. If you survive, you come back and you have a life again. A lot of the men returning from Vietnam lost their families because of the separation in time. A lot of them were wounded and their spouses didn't want them anymore. This is also true. This is one of the problems that combat nurses had to deal with because a lot of the men who were wounded realized they were going to have a problem when they got home. Some men came home and found out they were divorced and didn't even know it. Some of them were divorced while they were in Vietnam. They got Dear John letters. So yes, there is going to be a sequel to this, but I want to sit down and I want to make it very special because it'll be the end of the series. And this series took me years to write. And I want to make sure that when I polish it off with a final sequel, that it's worthy of the first 3 books that I wrote on it.
When you say it took a lot of time, I can believe that with all of the research and the character development that you went through. Whisper in My Ear, now available, volume 3 of 3. Of course, volumes 1 and 2 still available. You'll get information at John's website. I'll give you that here in a second. Also, other books that John has written available at the website. The Day God Played Baseball, dealing with a small-town bully. The Place Where the Giant Fell, dealing with prejudice in pre-statehood Arizona. And When Brothers Meet, talking about China and the world's oil supply. All 3 fascinating books as well, all from the author, John Henry Hardy, our guest on the program. The series we're talking about is Whisper in My Ear, Volume 3, now available. Books at Amazon. You can find it at John's website, johnhardy.com. And, of course, you can link on directly by going to our website, thisweekinamerica.us. John, a pleasure to have you on the program. Excellent job with this very engrossing portrayal of war and the study of people that conducted this war. It's a fascinating trilogy. Looking forward to the sequel. We will stay in touch and have you back when that's ready. Thank you so much for sharing all of this with us on the program today.
And Rick, thank you so much for having me on the program. It's really appreciated, and I hope that people learn something about the Vietnam War. I'm not important, the writer's not important, but what they did, that's what's important.
Well, you're the messenger, and we get sort of a whole different look. And we mentioned the role of women, the angelic roles of the combat nurse, all of that and more in the series Whisper in My Ear, the trilogy, volume 3 of 3, now available. John Henry Hardy, our guest and the author. jhhardy.com is his website. And, of course, you can link on directly by going to our website, thisweekinamerica.us. More on today's program right after these messages.